The time is at hand.
From the land of the rising crackheads in Williamson, West Virginia, you are in dark places. My name is Junebug Fugit. I witnessed a big battle of crackheads on January 27th. Went to Dairy Queen to pick up an ice cream cake for Brandon's birthday. He turned 15 on me on January 28th. So I was going to pick up the cake on the 27th to make sure I had it and junk. And there was a crackhead walking around the parking lot. And then as I was pulling out, I didn't really pay no attention. And just out of the blue, there was like 8 crackheads just in a pile around that one guy. I guess they were getting ready to beat him up or something, I don't know. But about the time I pulled out on the road, I saw the blue lights of a police car flashing. So I think he contained the crackhead situation. This week on the show, UFO Cults. UFO cults are groups that believe in the existence of extraterrestrial beings and often claim to have communication with them. These cults typically incorporate elements of spirituality and may promote the idea that aliens can help humanity solve various social and ecological issues. Stories are by Kevin McClure. Thanks, Kevin. The One World Family, founded by Alan Michael Noonan, is a California-based cult that has attracted some following. Many of its features recur in numerous other groups. In Noonan's case, it is said that he was working on a billboard when he was suddenly transported to another planet. He found himself surrounded by angelic creatures, seated around a fluorescent throne. A voice boomed, "Will you agree to be the savior of the world?" And Noonan agreed. He has since remained in contact with an extraterrestrial known as Ashtar, has made trips to an inhabited Venus, and regards himself as the Messiah. He is writing the massive reinterpretation of the Bible, the everlasting gospel, which his followers help him produce. He believes that he is the only mouthpiece for communications from Ashtar. Hallucinogenic drugs and the exercise of psychic abilities feature in the cult. Noonan also claims that, with the practical help of the aliens, the One World Family will eventually take over the government of the United States and the running of the United Nations, but only after all professing Christians have been eliminated. Alan Michael Noonan is one of the least wholesome characters to have founded a UFO cult, and it is impossible to tell whether or not he believes his own claims. But there is no doubt that his followers believe in both the claims and the individual, and try to act accordingly. A less sinister, but nonetheless remarkable cult, was the Institute for Cosmic Research, founded in Michigan, United States, in 1967 by a young man known as Gordon. This group was developed around the supposed construction of a flying saucer that would actually fly, the Bluebird. And the group lasted as long as its members had faith in the unique achievement that would climax its slow and painstaking creation. Gordon claimed that his birth was supernatural. He arrived in his mother's arms while a UFO hovered over the house. He was, he said, one of the 7 Great White Brothers, a common type of claim in pseudo-Eastern movements. He also affirmed that he, and he alone, was in contact with extraterrestrial entities from Io, one of the moons of Jupiter. There, he said, he had represented Earth at meetings of the Intergalactic Council. He told his followers that the Space Brothers had warned him that Earth's vortex is about to break because of an excess amount of hatred on the planet. However, the Space Brothers had a plan. In order to change the ways of mankind, they had chosen to provide Gordon with the technology to build a small flying saucer. Potential members of the Institute were told that only highly developed souls could be involved in work on it. They were to build the saucer and fly it into the skies. They would be joined by saucers from other planets, and together they would circle Earth for 3 days, darkening the sky. People would look up and then would fall on their knees and start practicing universal law. In Gordon's cosmology, the sun was cold, and all the stars, all of them, were inhabited planets. Despite all this, which surely must have been hard to believe, it is clear that Gordon had considerable charisma. The group lasted 7 years before the basic untruth of the claims dawned on its adherents. Even then, many of the group members were unwilling to accept the fact. It is desperately hard to admit that you have been so wrong for so long. The group had expended time, money, energy, and faith. In some ways, it is easier to go on believing than to have to cope with reality. The most famous and long-lived contactee cult of all was started in Britain in about 1955. The Atreus Society, which now has its headquarters in the London suburb of Fulham, has established itself in several of the world's major cities and has members in over 40 countries. Hundreds of devoted members attend the Society's activities in Britain and the United States. The story of the Atreus Society and its development is very much that of its founder, George King. He built the society from nothing and now is held in the highest esteem by its members. It is worth considering, in a field where cults and belief groups are mostly transcendent and ephemeral, why the Atreus Society has achieved a relatively wide appeal and has lasted so long. The key elements of the Society's doctrine are very similar to those of the One World Family and the Institute for Cosmic Research. It offered its adherents a cosmology that was then beyond scientific disproof. It asserted that most of the solar system was inhabited. It provided an explanation for a mystery that held a widespread fascination. The flying saucers had been seen all over the world. Many of them, it was said, represented a benign and concerned force, the Interplanetary Parliament. The doctrine imposed a task on the Society's members to store up, in conjunction with the extraterrestrial entities, spiritual energy in spiritual batteries located in high places all over the world. This energy could then be discharged to prevent hardship, disease, and disaster around the world. Lastly, the Society possessed a priest, a go-between, or a communicator, who alone had the ear of the Interplanetary Parliament, who would pass on the messages of the extraterrestrials, and in turn would represent his followers to the mightier powers beyond. That communicator, of course, was George King. The roots of the Atreus Society lie in King's fascination prior to 1954 with yoga and Eastern philosophy and metaphysics. His early life is not well known, but he was born in Shropshire in 1919 and at various times worked as a fire service employee and a hire car driver and ran a healing sanctuary. The publicity material has it that one day in May of 1954, when King was alone in his flat in West London, he heard a voice say, "Prepare yourself. You are to become the voice of Interplanetary Parliament." 8 days later, an Indian Swami of world renown, who had obviously walked straight through the locked door, gave him information and instruction that dramatically changed his life and led to the founding of the Society. And "You are responsible," King, not known for his humility, explains that he had to forsake his metaphysical studies, even though we believed that we were on the verge of discovering a new method of cancer treatment, which would cure certain forms of this malignant scourge. Nevertheless, this command came out of the blue in such a way that no receiver could do anything else but listen and obey. Quite soon after the deliverance of the command, I was able to tune in and receive, telepathically, information which was relayed over millions of miles of etheric space. A message from Venus was recorded on our tape recorder. To be a little skeptical, it might have been better for the world if George King had persisted with his work on cancer, for much of the information he said he had received and the experiences he claimed to have had, implausible enough at the time, have since been rendered utterly absurd by the discoveries of space exploration. King wrote of his travels to Venus and Mars and stated that Mercury was the only uninhabited planet. He detailed a battle he fought on a massive flying saucer of an interplanetary space fleet, 40 million miles from Earth. In public meetings, he gave trance messages from entities such as Mars, Sector 6, the Master Atreus, and even Master Jesus, who was apparently living on or near Venus. Without this last claim, the society might have been taken a little more seriously. However, in spite of the utter lack of verifiable evidence for any of King's clients, his meetings grew larger. A regular journal, The Cosmic Voice, was launched soon after the society's inception. The messages relayed by King in an apparent trance state were taken seriously and acted upon, though, like this example from Mars Sector 6, they were not always very clear. Take those M ions inside of yourself, and your brain cells will release an opposite female magnetic energy. This will counteract the hurricane force. That the society still thrives may seem surprising, but members, who seem often to be selfless and determined, concentrate much of their efforts on the task previously mentioned. They have made pilgrimages, often in difficult and dangerous conditions, to a number of the world's mountains to fulfill the aims of plans bearing such names as Operation Sunbeam, Operation Blue Water, and Operation Starlight. They have charged the spiritual energy batteries in such places as Ben Makati in Scotland, Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, and the Madrigalifa in Switzerland. On the night of June 27, 1981, for instance, batteries E1 and E3 were charged at Holdstone Down in southwest England. The 160 members of the societies who were present stored a total of 219 hours and 28 minutes of the prior energy in battery E1. Meanwhile, the extraterrestrials put 1,100 hours into battery E3. On the same weekend, as part of Operation Sunbeam, 6,000 prior hours of energy were sent from Jupiter to the Psychic Center in Scotland. Most UFO cults have appeared in the United States, long the home of countless eccentric religious and near-religious groups. The story of one of these cults is told in full by a trio of sociologists, Leon Festinger, Henry Racken, and Stanley Schrachter. They planted observers in a developing group centered on a UFO communicator in Lake City, Utah. The authors used fictitious names throughout in order to protect their subjects. The communicator was Marianne Keech, who believed she had received the initial message from her late father. She sat quietly and regularly thereafter, waiting to produce automatic writings. She was soon contacted by higher forces, first by the older brother and then by entities from the planets Clarion and Ceres, neither of which is known in conventional astronomy. She received communications especially from one Sananda of Clarion, who claimed to have been Jesus in an earlier time. Mrs. Keech did not publicize her messages enthusiastically, but others from exiting UFO groups and mystical or occult groups soon showed an interest, and in August of 1954, a press release was issued. This summarized not only the more philosophical part of the communications, in which the media took little interest, but also predictions regarding a coming physical disaster of vast proportions. The nature of this event, as reported by Mrs. Keech, varied at times, but as interest in the groups grew, its details became more firmly fixed. At the end of September, the Lake City Herald published this typical report. Lake City will be destroyed by a flood from Great Lake just before dawn, December 21st, according to a suburban housewife. Mrs. Marianne Keech of 847 West School Street says the prophecy is not her own. It is the purport of many messages she has received by automatic writings. She says the messages, according to Mrs. Keech, are sent to her by superior beings from a planet called Clarion. These beings have been visiting the Earth, she says, in what we call flying saucers. During the visits, she says, they have observed fault lines in the Earth's crust that foretooken the deluge. Mrs. Keech reports that she was told the flood will spread from an inland sea stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico, i.e., the Gulf of America. By now, Marianne Keech was referring to a group of communicators from whom she called the Guardians, though Sananda remained the most important. Once the media had started to publicize the group, Mrs. Keech and her associates began to to be afflicted by the problems that always beset UFO contactees. Increasing numbers of visitors called at her house, often when group members were present. She had explained to the group that if they did the right thing, they would be gathered together, ready at the appointed time. They would not be drowned in the forthcoming flood, but would be carried away in one of their flying saucers. The extraterrestrials would come to make contact at any time and in any way, so Mrs. Keach and her group had to decide whether or not the visitors were extraterrestrials, and also whether they were good or evil extraterrestrials. The cult had now fallen into the classical pattern. It had a communicator, an explanation for the UFO mystery, a message of great importance, and a task for its members. Not so much to publicize the disaster as to prepare themselves to survive it. As the chosen day had approached, the visitors became more frequent and more outlandish. Members of the group gave up jobs, possessions, and relationships. Some took up unusual diets, all who came together to await the fulfillment of the expectations. One condition of the escape required by the Guardians was that all metal should be removed from the participants' persons. This led to some interesting arrangements for trousers and brassieres, and a lively discussion about dental fillings. The last few days before December 21st were traumatic for the group members, as their hopes were first raised and then dashed by increasingly strange messages and predictions, all proving to be inaccurate. The greatest shock came on the day itself, when no flood arrived, nor any spacecraft to save them from it. The group fell prey to disillusion and in due course dispersed. And then there's these cats, the Light Affiliates. They were active in the late 60s in Burnaby, British Columbia. Their launching statement read, "We wish to notify all those interested that a phenomenon has occurred here in Vancouver. A young girl, aged 22, suddenly began channeling on October 23, 1969. Her source is a being identifying himself as Ox Ho, who is relaying transmissions from a galaxy close to our own. Her material is phenomenal in that she has been informed of the coming disasters, when to expect them, and what to do pertaining to the necessary evacuation of the danger areas and food supplies, etc. that will be needed." The real name of the channel was Robin McPherson, but she was renamed Estelle by the being. Her mother, Aileen, became Magdalene. Her friend Sally became Celeste. A young man involved in the early communications was given the evocative name Truman Merritt. Oxo explained that the Day of Judgment would begin during November 22, 1969. In these final hours, man would be given a last opportunity to repair his decadent house before the terminal series of disasters. If mankind did not take the opportunity to change, the Space Brothers would remove the Chosen and return them to Earth after the planet had once again been crystallized and been spiritually as well as physically restructured. The restructuring would involve the tilting of the Earth on its axis and the disappearance beneath the sea of large land areas. The members of the Light Affiliates were exhorted to evangelize wherever possible. Nothing seems to have happened on the predicted date to fulfill the expectations of the Light Affiliates. Robin McPherson ceased to communicate, but her mother continued the task. In an interview with the writer Brad Steiger in the mid-70s, she explained where the predictions had gone wrong. "We misinterpreted them, Brad, because it all happened so suddenly. The first visions I was given of destruction were very upsetting. I can see things now in a much broader perspective. The thing that is the first ascension, and it is a mental ascension. The brothers are trying to get as many people as possible into the kingdom. You know, I've been told by the Brotherhood that Earth is like an encounter therapy center for the psychotics of the universe. I have been shown that the Earth is also wobbling very drastically on its axis. It is sometimes less painful to find ways of showing that your beliefs are fundamentally correct by means of some elaborate reinterpretation than to concede that they are simply mistaken." The group that made the greatest impact of all during the 70s was called HIM, Human Individual Metamorphosis. This group appeared in California in 1975 and appealed to some of those who had dabbled in the drug culture, personal spiritual development, and New Age mysticism. The movement was run by a middle-aged man and woman. They adopted names that were modest enough, Bo and Peep. Their teaching offered the advantages of life after death without the inconvenience of dying. Instead, the adherents were to ascend physically. One of the cult's publicity posters read, UFOs, why are they here? Who have they come for? When will they land? 2 individuals say they were sent from the level above human and will return to that level in a spaceship within the next 3 months. This man and woman will discuss how the transition from the human level to the next level is accomplished and when this may be done. If you have ever entertained the idea there might be a real physical level in space beyond the Earth's confines, you will want to attend this meeting. Bo and Peep, formerly known as M.H. Applewhite, that guy, and Bonnie Nettles, had convinced themselves that they were more than human and had the strength of will and personality to maintain that impression. Converts were clearly quite overwhelmed by them. At first they claimed that they would one day be assassinated, and then they would be resurrected after 3 days. Later these dreams were set aside, as in other such groups members were expected to make sacrifices, to give up their names and possessions, abandon the use of drugs, alcohol, radio and television, or even read books. The members generally lived in semi-permanent camps. The words Bo and Peep, in an interview recounted by Brad Steiger, make their attitude to the family and other personal relationships clear. Husband and wife can take the trip at the same time, but not together. It would be impossible to become an individual if you were together on that trip. In order to leave this Earth's atmosphere, you must go alone and overcome whatever needs you have for any other individual or thing of this Earth. Anything for which you depend on another human being or anything on the Earth must be overcome. Being a member of him was more like being a Moonie than participating in a traditional religion or even a traditional UFO cult. But the structure of the group was like that of the other groups already described. There was a communicator, a message, a task. No one has yet ascended to another physical realm above the atmosphere. Not many people seem to have got their money back either. It turned out that Bo and Peep had met each other in a psychiatric hospital, where she was a nurse and he was a patient. Yet plenty of people remained willing to believe them and to accept their discipline. Like so many fringe religions, it seems to have met spiritual needs shared by many people at the same time. This guy Applewhite went on to lead the most famous UFO cult of all, Heaven's Gate. Following an anonymous tip, police enter a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, an exclusive suburb of San Diego, California, and discover 39 victims of mass suicide. The deceased, 21 women and 18 men of varying ages, were all found lying peaceably in matching dark clothes and Nike sneakers. How's that for a Nike commercial? And had no noticeable signs of blood or trauma. It was later revealed that the men and women were members of the Heaven's Gate religious cult, whose leaders preached that suicide would allow them to leave their bodily containers and enter an alien spacecraft hidden behind the Hale-Bopp comet. The cult was led by Marshall Applewhite, a music professor who, after surviving a near-death experience in 1972, was recruited into the cult by one of his nurses, Bonnie Lou Nettles. In 1975, Applewhite and Nettles persuaded a group of about 20 people from Oregon to abandon their families and possessions and move to eastern Colorado, where they promised that an extraterrestrial spacecraft would take them to the kingdom of heaven. Nettles, who called herself Ty, and Applewhite, who took the name of Doe, explained that human bodies were merely containers that could be abandoned in favor of a higher physical existence. As the spacecraft never arrived, members of the Heaven's Gate cult diminished, and in 1985, Bonnie Lou Nettles, Applewhite's partner, died. During the early 90s, the cult resurfaced as Applewhite began recruiting new members. Soon after the 1995 discovery of the comet Hale-Bopp, the Heaven's Gate members became convinced that an alien spacecraft was on its way to Earth, hidden from human detection behind the comet. In October of 96, Applewhite rented a large home in Rancho Santa Fe, explaining to the owner that his group was made up of Christian-based angels. Applewhite advocated abstinence, and several male cult members followed his example by undergoing castration operations. In 1997, as part of its 4,000-year orbit of the Sun, the comet Hale-Bopp passed near Earth in one of the most impressive astronomical events of the 20th century. In late March of 97, as Hale-Bopp reached its closest distance to Earth, Applewhite and 38 of his followers drank a lethal mixture of phenobarbital and vodka, and then lay down to die, hoping to leave their bodily containers, enter the alien spacecraft, and pass through Heaven's Gate into a higher existence. And then right after that is when the Phoenix Lights appeared. So, were they onto something? Oh dear, look at the time. We are woefully out of time. That's about all the stories about UFO cults that I've got for you. We'll see you again right here next week. Thanks for listening. God bless.